Decoding Future Leadership is an audiovisual podcast breaking open the capabilities, technologies, growth strategies, and mental fitness required to lead our future working world. A collaboration between PeopleStrong, the customer's choice for HR tech across Asia Pacific, and Future Leadership, each episode addresses the challenges of a hybrid workforce with a blend of human capability and HR technology solutions. Let's get into this week's episode.
Hello everyone, I'm Pip Youngman. It's my pleasure to welcome today's guest to the Decoding Future Leadership podcast, Sandeep Chaudhary. Sandeep is the CEO of PeopleStrong and says, as an organisation, they have always believed that employees are the real consumer of HR tech. As such, they invested early on in an AI-enabled, scalable and mobile-first architecture for their technology, which is offered to enterprises across Asia-Pac. Sandeep is an experienced business leader with deep functional expertise in human capital and business management. It's a pleasure to have him on the show today. Welcome, Sandeep.
Thank you, Pip. What a pleasure to get into this conversation with you.
So, Sandeep, we have known each other in a past life, and your work life now is in a very different field, moving from consulting to a fast-growing HR tech business at PeopleStrong. It would be great to hear about the transition that you've made. What's the same and what's different?
Yeah, Pip, honestly, when I look around, nearly about 23 years that I've essentially been working, I think the most wonderful part of my career has been to find countless opportunities to work with some amazing people as my colleagues and amazing people as clients that I've really had an opportunity to essentially serve in my consulting career and now in the world of technology with PeopleStrong. And along the way, made some wonderful lifelong friendships. And that's the reason why you and I are here in a conversation. It was wonderful to meet with you while I was at Aon. It was very inspiring to see how you essentially built and scaled and regionalized a business like Pivot Software. That still stays as an inspiration for me. Many decisions that I essentially take today in PeopleStrong, I do go back to how you were essentially envisaging and evangelizing your journey along with Pivot and the scale of that. 17 years at Aon, managing a large business, large brand, large firm was possibly one of the most exciting part of my life. And to be able to do it in the most vibrant part of the planet, which is in the emerging parts of Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, was very, very exciting. While I was at Aon, I obviously was from a bit of a distance witnessing the digital transformation that was taking place and reshaping our society, education, the future as our children were looking into the world 15 years ahead of them, how businesses were essentially transforming. I obviously was very fascinated by it, wanted to be a part of it, but could only do as much from Aon. And I really thought the best way to get into it was to jump straight into the world of tech. There was a bit of a fear of missing out that was kind of setting in me. Aon was on a brilliant trajectory, and I thought that was a wonderful time for me to step aside and almost end up reinventing myself, as many organizations and countries and economies are reinventing themselves around limitless opportunity that the technology is essentially throwing at the world. I came on board at PeopleStrong in January 2020. 10 weeks later, we were in a lockdown at home, nothing that I would have ever anticipated or prepared for. But yet again, I guess I was lucky to be at the right place at the right time, having something to offer to the world, which they needed the most at that point in time. So it has just been a wonderful journey of thrill, excitement, and immense gratitude to just have the opportunity that I've had so far.
You speak a lot about jumping in feet first into the HR tech, but of course there's a lot of people that sit around this technology, and we're delivering to to a people problem, right? And so as a CEO, what has COVID done for you in terms of how you have to do things differently as a CEO now?
Yeah, honestly, I think there is no tutorial, even today, as we've lived through the pandemic for nearly about 24 months, that how to lead an organization or an enterprise amidst a pandemic, a global pandemic. So I guess the pressure of doing that is as an understatement of the century. But jokes apart, it certainly has provided me an opportunity, and I think all the leaders right now, which is once in a generation kind of an opportunity for CEOs and leaders to evolve the nature and impact of their role. It's truly been a beautiful balance and a rather very precarious balance to essentially create between employee welfare and well-being, because that really came right at the center when we saw the virus and the crisis and the scare that it was essentially creating for not just the livelihood, but more importantly, even for the lives. And then actually be able to look at the crisis, go back to the old age adage of don't waste a crisis, and understand what do we have in our business right now? What can we do that will help us maximize the opportunity? And I do believe that almost every well-thought business had to go back onto re-looking at their purpose and finding that to be the most energizing statement of sorts. Because maybe in the near term, all the right decisions that you would have essentially taken on your business, on your employees, would have not necessarily created immediate commercial returns for yourself or for your shareholders. But clearly in the mid, near, and the long term, those were the right decisions to essentially take. Now, imagine a situation right after 10 months of me having started with PeopleStrong, millions of employees around the world, including about 2,000 of the PeopleStrong employees, were sent home. They were connecting from wherever they were. And there were organizations who immediately had a fear of lack of control, massive losses in productivity and performance. They really didn't know how to collaborate with employees, how to bring them together, and so on and so forth. And at that point in time, there were many things that essentially overnight just came out to be priceless currencies that organizations really had to harness to stay relevant, stay connected, not just with their employees, but with their suppliers, with their clients, and so on and so forth. And I do believe that it was the realization at that point in time that the world saw that one of the very strong pillars of organizational culture, which is about the infrastructure, outside of the other two, which is leadership and people practices, infrastructure was not about having those great office buildings and everything that we essentially provided to our employees within those buildings in terms of every tool and every other element of infrastructure that was enhancing their engagement, improving their productivity, the way they were able to collaborate, and so on and so forth. And that was a role that got very quickly replaced by technology, work tech, or HR tech, whatever we really want to be able to call them. And again, I found that to be a very, very powerful objective to go back and reconnect with our purpose, which is to bring joy, meaning, and energy to work, and say, okay, so what are we going to be doing first for our 2,000 employees, approximately, and then be able to connect with about 1.5 million of our client employees that we essentially service across multiple geographies. Really, if I was to sum up, I guess the CEO's role or the leader's role in the society was to bring in a broader emotional and a human dimension to the decisions that they were supposed to take. And take those decisions when they themselves were quite wet behind the ears. They didn't know as much as they actually knew about the elements that they had practiced for multiple times over. And this is really for the first time that I do believe almost a strategy or a lack of it, the way you would like to interpret, where you had to throw in the morning about 10 things on the wall, hoping a couple of them are going to stick, and that's really the ones that you will persist for maybe the next 1 month or 2 months. and then reevaluate and so on and so forth. So I guess the resilience, the nimbleness, and the ability to call out vulnerability as strength rather than a limitation was again that came at the forefront of how leadership had to come and engage with their people, because certainly it was not the CEOs who had all of the smart answers. Things weren't really very rosy, I guess, for anyone, whether you were in technology, which obviously ended up benefiting the most out of the crisis, or you were in healthcare, or you were in manufacturing, which in my opinion actually had the biggest challenge. It's easy for us to connect the white-collar workforce, the so-called knowledge workers, through technology, make them very functional, get them very used to the new way of work, and so on and so forth. But what do you do about the workforce which is sitting in the factories? They still need to come into the plants. The plants need to open up. They need to yank their engines and machines to essentially get into the mode of manufacturing. And irrespective, I think, whichever part of the sector you essentially came in from, you did find a brilliant opportunity to turn the crisis on its head. And it's been very, very evident. 8 months out of the first lockdown, we clearly saw businesses, organizations across every segment that turned back at the start line stronger, leaner, more agile, and having something even more compelling to offer to the world, while exactly the same organizations with the same kind of employees competing in the same market were kind of struggling because they either did little, or the little that they did was actually eroding value because how they just focused on the near term and not for the long term.
And do you see, I guess, our research feeds are talking a lot about this Great Resignation. So people are reevaluating what work means to them. And, you spoke a little bit about those that are now coming back stronger and those that are weak. So this is really that workforce imbalance, or the talent economy really starting to work, where the employee has a much stronger say in what happens next. So how can organisations that haven't bounced back strong, how can they make up for that lost time quickly enough to not now have another crisis on their hands, which is all about their people?
Yeah. Honestly, Pip, I'm quite embarrassed about the Great Resignation, because I think in many ways it tells us the story of how, again, the leaders in organizations were just very, very knee-jerk and short-term in their reaction. The response was not just thought through. They were very quick to focus on employee cost. And the way they reacted is the way they just completely lost trust with current and prospective employees. Honestly, the Great Resignation is a reality check, again, that HR is not to be managed for the downturn. It is to be managed for the long term. You clearly got to be able to stick out your neck at points in time, manage the shareholders, talk to the street on what's important for the long-term success of the business, and effective communication, I guess, coming in from the CEO, from the board, from the leaders, unanimously being very, very consistent in the messages that they really want to be able to take to all of their stakeholders, in many cases was kind of missing. And even, unfortunately, the ones that did a great job of it were caught in this entire whirlwind of the Great Resignations, because one thing leads to the other. And then everybody started to talk about the transactional wins that employees were having because of the Great Resignation. There were great salaries. The salary inflation in many functions and several skill areas has just gone through the roof, which I think is very, very unsustainable. And again, the companies that are making those mistakes will be the first ones to yet again embarrass themselves in a period of another 24 to 36 months, when they wouldn't be able to make commercial sense of the costs that they've essentially mounted on wages. That was one. The second really also was that organizations, I do believe, are still living in a bit of a notion of a post-pandemic world. They're still hoping that all of this will kind of end and we will be back to our normal self. A normal self was what they were doing back. And I constantly keep saying what we were doing previously was not normal. Many of that had to change. And if we don't look at this pandemic, a great reason or an opportunity for us to reevaluate a lot of it in terms of the definition of work, the definition of workplace, and the kind of workforce that we really want to be able to bring in. Then again, in my opinion, we kind of very quickly losing out on the opportunity to re-engage ourselves in a very meaningful way. All said and done, COVID and the pandemic did get people to reflect a little bit more deeply about their lives and work lives. And how do they really want to be able to create a better balance of finding their own personal purpose. For example, I certainly went through a lot of self-discovery in this phase of just knowing a lot of what I was doing in the pre-pandemic world was so unnecessary, so non-value adding that it constantly just kind of kept me away from the things that actually made a bigger difference and a far more brought significant meaning to either my professional existence or my personal existence, and so on and so forth. So even today, when I guess people are looking at the pandemic reshaping the definition of work, workplace, and workforce, I'm not too sure how many organizations are actually ready to bring in employees that would want to engage very differently the way they've essentially engaged with their employees in the pre-pandemic world. There's been a massive exodus from the cities into smaller places, getting closer to nature, improving the overall quality of life. We clearly saw sitting in crowded cities was unnecessary, expensive, and taking a very different kind of a stress on our lives. Clearly, I guess, eroding a good quality of life that I guess everybody deserves. And when I look at the systems that organizations have, when I look at the policies that they've essentially been framing, which have been very, very interim, again, I do feel it is all just to manage through the pandemic, and very quickly, the moment the pandemic is over, we like to go back to our original ways of working. And I think that's going to be the reason why the Great Resignation in many ways will continue. People have realized that it's not just money that can get me to work with an organization. There is a lot more of a holistic balance that I expect my employers to create for me. I'm willing to take 2 steps forward, but I need support, I need infrastructure, and for that, I'm willing to manage my own expectations around compensation and many other elements. So I do believe there is a little bit more thought required from enterprises as they look at how some of the things should actually change forever and for the better.
It's interesting you say that, and you talk about organisations wanting to go back to the way things were before. I also wonder, is there a honeymoon period on this remote working? And I feel perhaps that hybrid model of a little bit in the office, a little bit at home is likely to be where we settle. I worked remotely for many years in the course of my work life, and it can actually be quite isolating at times, in that you often find that your work interactions are quite formal and planned and structured, and you have this Zoom fatigue. So your social interactions and your social relationship building within a work environment is a lot more difficult. So some people are still celebrating this newfound freedom, but I wonder, how do you see it? Where do you think it will land for likes of PeopleStrong, and how do we keep that heart of PeopleStrong beating strong as we move into this new world?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't think it is wise for us to replace one dogma with another. Clearly, I guess organizations have to be significantly more agile. They have to bring in more flexibility. They have to bring in more mobility for remote work and create a hybrid dynamic workforce, and also the entire infrastructure to essentially be able to manage that. But even for hybrid, you've got to be very clear of for what reasons and which employees